Okay, and we'll bring everybody. Did you get Mark Chaparro?
Still waiting on Mark, Santita. He hasn't jumped
Okay,
on yet.
okay, perfect. Hey, 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 everybody. Hey, hey, hey. Hi. Let's talk about it with Santita Jackson and friends. Let's talk about it with Santita Jackson and friends on Indigenous Peoples Day. Well, how you doing, everybody? Please like and share. Like and share. If you're joining us on YouTube, like and subscribe. And if you're joining us on Facebook, like and share. Like and share. Like and share. Commissioner Brandon Johnson, it's good to see you. Dwight McKee, it's good to see you. Everybody come off mute so when I call you, you can jump right on in because we're going to be here. Not going to be for a long time today, but we do want to get as much substance out of this conversation as we can. This morning on my own radio show, on the Santita Jackson Show on the nation's largest progressive talk radio station, we talked about this and we felt that a lot of the issues that we touched upon were so pressing and needed a little bit more elaboration. We said we'd come back here tonight. So, hey, Ashley, hey, Andre, everybody like and share, like and share, like and share. And try to meet us over on YouTube on the Santita Jackson Show channel. We've been told that we need to get on over there. And so we want to cooperate and we need to build up those numbers there. And so we need your help to do it. And so producing the show tonight, aside from myself, is Chaparral Wells. I can't wait for her to jump in and say something. I know she's got some thoughts and opinions. She always does. But we've got to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day, which is now a federal holiday, and it is a federal holiday alongside, conjointly with Columbus Day. Some people might feel that's a contradiction. Some people might feel that that's a good compromise. Other people object to it completely. Some people hold on to the idea that Columbus discovered America, and the fact is, he actually never got to what became the United States in 1492. He ended up in the Caribbean, and indeed, he was lost. That's why he called indigenous people Indians, because he thought he was going to be in India, and that did not happen. And so, what about the Christopher Columbus that we learned about in school? The Christopher Columbus that most of us learned about in school is not the Christopher Columbus experienced by the indigenous people. And so we're going to talk about that with our panel. And so I want to hear from you, everybody. Hey, Maurice. Hey, Gladys. Hey, Philip. Thank you so much for joining us today. And let's continue this conversation about Indigenous Peoples Day because I think it's very, very important. Indeed, it is a moment for our time. I don't think anyone could have been more shocked that I think it was last year when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that nearly half of Oklahoma belongs to the indigenous people. Wow. We have never respected, our government has never respected a treaty uh, drawn between our government and indigenous people. Never, ever, ever, ever. And so for the first time, that actually happened. They're still working out the details. But in an oil rich territory like Oklahoma, those that could be substantial. It could be a game changer for the indigenous people. So we want to talk about that, everybody. We want to talk about what happened to the indigenous people. And we've got our social scientist, the brilliant Dr. D. Dwight McKee. Indeed, he's one of the founders of Operation Push and the National Action Network. And he does a lot of great work here in Chicago and all around the country. We cannot wait to see this documentary that was debuted at the Tribeca Film Festival about the work that he and Reverend Dr. Marshall Hatch and Arnie Duncan and company are doing with our young people on the west side of Chicago. And we've got Commissioner Brandon Johnson, and we want to start with him today. Brandon Johnson is a union leader. He is a teacher. He is a father. He is a husband, a great man of the community who has moved his social service, his public service to another level. He is now one of the highest ranking officials in our county, in one of the largest governments in the United States of America. He is a Cook County commissioner, and he's done something really brave. He said, we need to not only acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day. Well, why don't we let you tell the story? Because you've also gotten some pushback. Commissioner Johnson, welcome to the
We
show.
have,
And I must
yeah,
say,
thank you.
you are also that's right, responsible in part for getting me my job at WCPT, but you have your own radio show. I don't know how you do it. You have your own radio show on WCPT every Sunday, everybody, at 9 a.m. WCPT, Chicago's Progressive Talk. So there you go.
Well, thank you, Santita, and good evening. It's good to be with, of course, our fellow brother, Dr. McKee, and your entire family tonight, the Santita and Jackson and Friends family. Look, I mean, I think it's, we're very evident to those of us who believe in righteousness and justice, that Indigenous Peoples Day is a day that is long overdue in terms of not just celebration, but our government recognizing the obviously the contribution that the Indigenous people have made throughout our globe, but also recognizing the horrific atrocities that have taken place. What was very evident to me, particularly as a public school teacher, how contradictory our political systems are. And today, let me just say that there were hundreds of thousands of students throughout Cook County, individuals, again, who are part of the Chicago public school system. We also have the Oak Park School District, which is in my county district, celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day today, which is an absolute historic moment. Now, there are individuals that are still holding on to a very, nasty past. And, I'm not going to steal too much of the thunder from Dr. McKee, even though I am a highly qualified social studies teacher, but I'm going to yield to our veteran historian on the panel tonight. But what we essentially did at the county level, it's critically important that our policies are reflecting our mission for equity and justice. And right now, there's an incredible contradiction on our calendar. And so though there were students across Cook County that were celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, unfortunately, the county still pays people to have a day off in honor of someone who's responsible not just for genocide, but ushering in one of the most dramatic, brutal forms of an economy that obviously people still benefit from, and that's the transatlantic slave trade. And so what I introduced at the county level a year ago was a resolution policy that would create Indigenous Peoples Day and Reconciliation Day. And let me just say why it's important that we indicate it's not just Indigenous Peoples Day, but it's Reconciliation Day. That our brothers and sisters who are indigenous to this land here in Cook County, though they were at the tip of the spear of the most violent acts done against mankind in the Western Hemisphere, they were prepared to share the day with other cultures and other people groups that have also experienced discrimination and hate. And so it was a day to lift up and obviously honor and recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, but also bring reconciliation and healing to all of the different cultural groups that have experienced harm. But to your point, Santita, there's been some pushback, and happy to dig into that a little bit, but I'm very confident that as our students continue to lead, this incredible movement that obviously Reverend Jackson and the folks before him, helped solidify. We're standing on the righteous shoulders of families who've been fighting for justice for generations. And so this generation that we're in the midst of, Black, brown, and white throughout Cook County, a very broad support of organizations and leaders want Cook County to lead the way, not just in terms of our presentation, but what we actually do in government. And so I'm still very hopeful that we actually can have a real holiday, a legitimate holiday on the books that celebrates Indigenous people, as well as other efforts to bring reconciliation and healing to a very much troubled land, Santita, that we live in.
Well, before we get to Dr. McKee, I'd like to find out what is some of the pushback that you're getting, because it sounds you've gotten pushback from one of your Black colleagues. You've gotten pushback from, I guess, some people in the Italian American community. And to be fair, they're not monolithic. There are many Italian Americans who feel that we should have Indigenous Peoples Day. So, I mean, it's really a very interesting mix. What's going on with the Cook County Board of Commissioners?
Yeah, right. So let's start with, the very obvious pushback that we're getting from some handful of individuals who are part of the Italian American community. And to your point, It's not all. There's countless support of Italian Americans across Cook County that are supportive of this. My colleague, Commissioner Kevin Morrison, who is an Italian American, was a co-sponsor of this resolution. And so there are individuals that still hold to, a very wicked, troubling past, and they want to rewrite history of who Christopher Columbus was. And, that depravity and poor education that folks are still living under is one that we have to continue to help people come to a better conclusion. One of the staunchest resistors to Indigenous Peoples Day, Professor Graber, someone who doesn't believe in the 1619 Project. She actually disputes the accounts that our ancestry experienced in the Western Hemisphere through, again, one of the more brutal forms of an economy, which of course was executed through slavery, right? And so we have those folks, and again, it's a loud minority of individuals that want to cling to that very wicked past and don't want to let go, and we see that in all different cultures, but particularly in this one, where obviously there's been legitimate discrimination against Italian Americans, and so we don't dismiss that, but the rationale behind Christopher Columbus is absolutely offensive and it's egregious. And so again, that history is what it is, and it's important to us that we educate people on who Christopher Columbus was and what his responsibility was in terms of wiping out an entire group of people. As far as other colleagues, I have a colleague on the board who is a descendant of freedmen, and these were Blacks who were enslaved and then further enslaved, or that enslavement extended along the Trail of Tears, where there were a handful of native tribes that enslaved. Well, they not only just enslaved, but they had enslaved Africans or enslaved Blacks along the Trail of Tears, and then unfortunately, that there is a lack of recognition of our indigenous brothers and sisters who are freedmen amongst a few tribes. Now, look, there are hundreds of tribes, if not thousands of tribes throughout North and South America. But there is one tribe, of course, who we know, the Interior Secretary, Secretary Holland, whose tribe has recognized freedmen and have placed them, if you will, on the Dawes Rolls. So there are benefits that freedmen receive as a result of their ancestry. There are still a few tribes that we have to encourage, and Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, has helped lead this effort at the federal level to get these constitutionally separate institutions, if you will, or bodies of government, these tribes to do what her tribe has done. And quite frankly, there are indigenous people here who support this effort. So we don't believe that these efforts have to be, mutually exclusive, if you will. We believe that the authority that we have at the county level, we can honor and recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, Reconciliation Day, while also pushing for the three remaining tribes, I believe, that still need to recognize freedmen.
And absolutely, and I think certainly that is a fight that is ongoing. We see Chief Hoskins of the Cherokee Nation, who's been fighting to get the freedmen their full rights as members of the nation, and it's an evolving process. It's a growing process because also, to be fair, sometimes Black people were drafted to fight Indigenous people. We saw that, interestingly enough, fictionally portrayed in Buck and the Preacher, the great film by Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte from 50 years ago. So, we are evolving. I'm going to point out to Chaparral, we're waiting for Attorney Mark Fancher. He's waiting for a link so that he can join us. We certainly cannot wait to hear what he's got to contribute. And we thank you, Commissioner Johnson, for waging this fight, and it is not over. Dwight McKee, your thoughts about Indigenous Peoples Day, about Columbus Day. Should we swap one for the other? I mean, how should this work? Dwight McKee, can you hear us?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, I can. I don't think you should swap one for the other. I think you should tell the truth about both. The problem with Columbus Day is the mythology that surrounds Columbus. It's not real history. It is manufactured to create this image of an explorer who was sent by God to do sacred things. And because of that, the Western Hemisphere benefited from his excursion, and also that the indigenous people also benefited because the Western world brought civilization to the tribes. And that's a myth. Is the people here were as civilized as the people in Europe had been for thousands of years. There were major civilizations over here, the Aztecs, the Incas, and Columbus came over and brought with him not explorers, but actually invaders who saw an opportunity because they were struggling so much in Europe and because they were looking for new trade routes to India, saw it as an opportunity to take somebody else's land. And then because the land was overwhelming to them, they then brought over people from the African tribes to work the land for free. And so they set up two systems. One, a system of capitalism, which was a land grab, and secondly, a system of slavery that lasted for 400 years with the people from Africa. Columbus really started that momentum historically, and it should be told. His guys we brought over here, for whatever reasons they had, plundered and raped the natives and enslaved some of the natives and took them back and paraded them around Europe and Spain. And he certainly should be acknowledged as a fact in history, but he should not be honored and celebrated. All history is relevant if the truth is told. And the truth of Columbus is that he was a man on a mission for self-aggrandizement. He had in his contract with Isabella that he would be the emperor of all that he found, and became one of the great colonizers in history. That should be told that way, and he should be acknowledged and not honored.
What do you have been a teacher, Commissioner Johnson. What do you tell children? I mean, particularly, now the landscape is changing. How do you teach Christopher Columbus to the children? I mean, I know I was raised, and my parents, I realize they are a little different, but not really the movement people. So I learned about Columbus early on. I learned about Lincoln not being in love with black people, but didn't make him an indecent guy, but that he wanted us to go back to Africa first, and that he was trying to save the Union first. How do you frame this for children? Because for people to push back on this, it just doesn't seem right.
Well, I think that's the great contradiction that we're living in right now, Santita, is that, as I said at the top of the hour, the Chicago public schools, with the work of a very broad coalition, fought to remove, Columbus as a paid holiday and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. That's a community, of course, of students that I'm, very familiar with. My own children, obviously, are students in the Chicago public school system. So that was a step in the right direction. As I mentioned, Oak Park School District, one of the wealthier school districts, quite frankly, in the country. Here's a school community. It's a pretty diverse community just to the west of us. They also celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. On the north end in Cook County, you have Evanston, again, another very dynamic, diverse community. So what I'm getting at is that there's obviously, to your question, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Doing a little bit too much with my technology today. That's why you put your kids in charge. But
yes.
there's a real commitment throughout Cook County for individuals to recognize that the true history of who Christopher Columbus is. And so, to your question, a lot of folks are raising that. And what you do is you simply tell them the truth. right? I mean, you tell them the truth, and what the best part about teaching young people is that they can actually handle and absorb the truth, right? It's older people who struggle with it because they want to hold on to their truth even when they know it's wrong, right? And so, part of it is you have to start with a history that highlights and elevates who we are and who we were before this brutal act of terror, right? I know Professor McGee could dig a little bit deeper into the dark ages and what European nations were confronted with at a very, very dark time for their own, regional history. And so, like, when you celebrate that, and I taught middle school for a good portion of my career, I did teach a year at high school. The awakening that students experience as a result of truth, people know it because it's liberating, Santita. And the reason why it's so important that we bring that historical truth is because it helps bring some context to what our experiences are today. And so, for instance, when I taught in Cabrini Green and the isolation that families experience as a result of abject poverty, it wasn't difficult for my students in Cabrini Green to connect their struggle of apartheid with the families in South Africa, right? Because they had great context of not just who we were before the transatlantic slave trade, but as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, how our peoples were ultimately stratified and separate, and how those policies were birthed out of the inferiority that white supremacy wanted to project on our people. And that truth, I can tell you, middle school students can handle that because I taught them, right? Children as young as 11 and 12 years old can recognize that the poverty and the circumstances in which we live in, and you make that connection globally, it had to be engineered by something and someone. And so it actually wanted them, to Professor McKee's point, it wanted them to dig in more about who these individuals were and who they are. Because who they were, there's a part of that existence that's still here today. And that type of education empowers us and gives us the direction that we need to ultimately fight the very global system that birthed out of the transatlantic slave trade. And then from there, you begin to talk about our fight and our plight for justice, and that we're not the only generation that has held to our ultimate desire, which is to experience ultimate liberation. And so that type of experience that students are having in our public schools across America, and particularly here in Cook County, there are individuals that feel threatened by that because that they know that that truth is prevalent.
Dwight McKee, what do you think
Yes.
about that? I mean, what about this this pushback? I mean, children get it. It sounds like the gospel, Commissioner Johnson. It should be so simple. Everything is so plain that even a child can understand it. Now, children can understand this. What is the disconnect with adults? Dwight?
Well, that's the fear. The fear is the children will understand it, and once they understand it, they can match their perspective to the truth. This society is based on propaganda and lies, and so the myth of white supremacy needs lies.
You know what? I think we're getting, we are in the midst of a storm here in Chicago. In fact, we have a tornado warning. So I think that is what you're seeing, some of the disconnectivity. But we have attorney Mark Fancher with us today. And we are so excited that he is with us. National Conference of Black Lawyers, brilliant columnist, author. There is so much that you can contribute to this conversation about Indigenous Peoples Day. You know what? You're not late. You got here just on time, Attorney Fancher. Talk to us. Indigenous Peoples Day, Columbus Day. It's a shared holiday now. Now, President Biden, to be fair, he's the first American president to grant this status, to acknowledge this in this way. But do you think that this is, should we trade one for the other? Um, or, I mean, what do you think about Indigenous Peoples Day, Columbus Day? What is it? What should we understand about where we are with this?
Well, I guess on some level, this represents progress, the mere fact that they're willing to acknowledge Indigenous people. But in practical terms, it is comparable to creating a special memorial service and service to celebrate uh, a murder victim and a murderer. Why is the murderer being honored at all? You may want to focus attention on the person that was killed, but why focus on the killer? And when we talk about Cristobal Colon, as he was called back then, or Christopher Columbus, he was nothing but a mass murderer. When he first landed in, the island that is Haiti and Dominican Republic, then called Hispaniola, when he saw the Taino people, who were the indigenous peoples of that island, if you look at his diary entry or his journal entry, the first entry says, they will make good servants. And, that was his first thought, was enslaving these people. And then over the course of the next 20 years, he reduced a population of 8 million Taino people by 99%. And this was the result of a long process of enslavement, torture, and massacres. It was so bloody that the rivers ran red with blood. So the reason or the rationale for honoring such a man escapes me.
Well, tell me, what is the pushback about? Because as you can see, our commissioner, Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson, he is meeting some resistance from the Black freedmen, from some members of the Italian American community, although David Maciota, our very dear friend, whose newest book is I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters, brilliant writer from Ceylon, he said, I'm Italian American, don't put me in this. As a matter of fact, I don't support Columbus Day at all. And you do have the David Maciotas out here. What gives? Mark Venture.
Well, I think that, it in many ways, reaction and pushback is almost impulsive. It's instinctive because there are many, and especially now, who feel that their way of life, America as they've known it, is being taken away. Little things that they've become accustomed to for so long, are being taken away, all in the interest of what we regard as historical justice, racial justice, or whatever it may be, but which they regard as inappropriate or wrong-headed political correctness. And it's just further effort to take away everything that's precious about the country, without necessarily thinking about the issues substantively. It's just impulsive. You're taking something else away. So that frequently accounts for it. But beyond that, it's just a resistance to anything that makes it possible for people to think about the historical realities and what actually happened in this country. I mean, the United States is a country which has made denial a fine art. It has been the only way that many, particularly white people in this country, have been able to live with themselves because they know the truth. They understand all of the genocide and the process of enslavement and the systemic oppression that has gone into making this country that they claim that they love so dearly. And to think about the reality of what accounts for their comfort, what accounts for their wealth, what accounts for their status is deeply troubling to them. And they have developed many mechanisms for shutting down any type of discussion about the historical reality of this country. And to in any way suggest that Christopher Columbus was a criminal, or mass murderer, or any of that, that's part of it, and they just would rather not think about it. It's too deeply troubling for them.
Well, it does seem that it would be helpful, Mark, or help me out here, if we knew just how bloody, how violent, if we knew the truth of what happened in Hispaniola. I don't think that we even know just how brutal it was, Mark. We have no idea. When you say that, and when we see that 99% of that population was wiped out, and close to that was wiped out here in the United States, we can't even fathom that, how that could happen. And let alone in 20 years, you go from 8 million persons to 28,000. You can't even, I can't wrap my mind around that, Mark. And White and Brandon. First you, Mark, and then let me go around, because it's hard to even imagine. And everyone over here all of you who are on the chat line, can you imagine having 99% of a population wiped out? 99%. Is anyone really, really dealing with that? Have you heard that before? Mark Fancher.
Well, we're seekers of truth. We want to know the truth. And when we know that it's available, we say, bring it on. And we have trouble comprehending it. We have trouble fathoming it. Can you imagine how difficult it is for people who don't want to know the truth?
Yeah.
It accounts in a big way for why these efforts to tell historical truth don't get traction. I mean, this whole phenomenon of the attack on what is purportedly critical race theory, but which is not, in the schools, has everything to do with that. They know how disturbing all of this is, and they don't want their children to have to deal with the truth about it. And they're trying to protect them, and to protect them psychologically and otherwise from things that would cause them to become very, very highly alarmed about what this country is all about. And I think we just have to understand that as part of the current reality.
Brandon, would it be impolitic of you to present that to the Cook County Board of Commissioners? I mean, with the pushback that you've gotten, would you? Because if you introduce the numbers in the United States, which are close to, which are in the 90% range, how many? We eliminated their buffalo, so they couldn't eat. We eliminated the population. I mean, there was a lot that happened in this part of the Americas. What do you think the reaction would be? Do you think it would be helpful for us to know those things, to know those facts, Commissioner?
It absolutely is helpful for us to know those facts. I want to just take a quick step back here to what Mark was just indicating, is that there is a desire to protect not just their history, but they're trying to protect their privilege. No one wants the Black experience in America. And I'll be the first to say I don't blame them. And the graduation that many people groups have to whiteness gives them the access, the privilege that they want to hold on to. And so by understanding and knowing the truth, no one wants to be associated with the type of degradation and the humiliation and the brutality that Black folks have experienced in America and what our Indigenous brothers and sisters have experienced in America. Santita, is actually quite gruesome. Women were raped and killed. Men were tortured and killed. This is a very wicked and nasty part of our history that, quite frankly, it's imperative that we confront it, because the type of violence that this country has experienced under that brutal system, we're not that far removed from our attempt in the 60s to right those wrongs, right? I mean, we're still dealing with generations who are for the first time graduating from college or experiencing some degree of middle class or working class. That these systems that whiteness is attempting to protect is ultimately trying to keep us in position. And that a position that they're trying to keep us in is the very position that Christopher Columbus got excited about, to be subservient, to be marginal, for our humanity not to be recognized. It was very disheartening that the County Board of Commissioners were more afraid of the idea of who Christopher Columbus was than the experiences that people had under his reign. And what was sanctioned by the so-called 5 European empires to ultimately find the greatest precious form of an economy, which was free labor and the complete annihilation of the people who actually were on the land. And so absolutely it's critical for not just young people, but for adults who have been miseducated. They have been miseducated. And that fear and what white supremacy has done to reinforce privilege, but also reinforce inferiority, where you have grown people still afraid of Christopher Columbus. Our message today is you don't have to be afraid of him anymore. He's not here. And it's imperative that as a body of government, that we do right by the cries of our ancestors. You know, to think that one particular character could be worshiped and also be seen as a symbol of genocide and rape and murder, it highlights the complexity that we experience here in America. And that's why Indigenous Peoples Day, Reconciliation Day, is not just a holiday, but it's a reckoning of truth, so that our policies moving forward can be adjusted that ultimately deals with the complete liberation of people who have suffered at the hands of a very nasty, wicked system.
Dwight, is it important that we know the details? Dwight?
And before you get to reconciliation, you have to get to restoration, because their debt's old. Is that even to this day, the gold that they stole from the indigenous people are sitting in the Vatican Bank, even to this day. Cathedrals in Spain, to this day, much of the gold that they stole from the Americas are sitting in the vaults in London. And so once you come to the truth, there is some responsibility for restoration, for accountability. And so you're duty bound to restore those things that you stole from these indigenous people. The whole economy of Europe was built off the backs of the gold and the silver that they stole out of the Americas. It really created the European economy of the industrial age. And so those are debts due. You really have to kind of divvy up this country to give it back to the natives. Oklahoma is just part of what we owe them. But Illinois is an Indian tribe. Wisconsin is an Indian tribe. Iowa is an Indian tribe. Mississippi is an Indian tribe. All of these lands are the lands of the Indian. The next state over is called Indiana, as in Indian. It's all of this. This is stolen land that needs to be reckoned and dealt with. And so part of the myth of white superiority, the myth of manifest destiny, and the divine rights of these white people to take this country by any means necessary.
Do you think that you talk about reconciliation, Commissioner Johnson? Why was it important to the indigenous community to include other people who have been born under or who've lived under the boot of oppression?
When you understand the impact that trauma can have on an entire nation, an entire group of people, you become especially sensitive to the impact that that brutality has on other people. You know, when I begin to first understand, you know, the history of our indigenous brothers and sisters, you know, the idea and the concept of what land meant, what community meant, what it meant to worship, and how you know, ownership had a much different context and connotation, right? The understanding of what it meant to be we and us, and that like, even as I think as a public school teacher, we've been working hard, Santita, in schools to lift up restorative justice, right? To allow the community to be responsible, to hold the community accountable, right? And so there's a history of that type of restorative nature, right? And that is birthed out of the experiences and the culture of our indigenous brothers and sisters. And so that's why it's a very humbling position to be in, to not just lift up Indigenous Peoples Day, but to hear from our indigenous community saying that, yes, though we were at the tip of the spear of this brutal act that became, again, a system and an economy that everybody else had benefited from, except for the people who were meant to carry out this economy in the most inhumane way, that as a people, we recognize that our healing is important, and we want to help usher in healing for all cultural groups. You know, the fact that we have a long history of Black folks escaping plantations to find comfort with our indigenous brothers and sisters, to fight alongside one another, to root out white supremacy. And here we are hundreds of years later, where you literally have a broad coalition of Black, brown, and white folks. And I know you know this well, Santita, because you grew up with this concept and this idea as Reverend Jesse Jackson fought to bring this rainbow coalition into fruition, particularly in electoral politics. Like, we are imbibing the spirit of our ancestors, the same ancestors that fought alongside one another to root out white supremacy. The great, 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 great of those folks are now fighting those same structures, and we're doing it in a way that our ancestors could only dream of, right? So the desire to have reconciliation is tethered to something bigger than just the brutality. That moment for reconciliation is about bringing ultimate restoration and healing to people so that we can move forward, and that we can be a great nation, that we can live out the fruits of the spirit, if you will, where every single person has access to the things that folks are clinging to out of fear: the access to a quality education, the access to jobs, the access to housing and affordability and transportation. I mean, these are things that we've been fighting for literally for hundreds of years. And now it's our turn to live out and express our liberation in a way that, again, our ancestors literally were brutalized and murdered for believing in.
You know, it's very interesting because you see a lot of people feel a lot of different ways about this, Mark Fancher. I'm looking at some of the questions here on the chat line. Larry said, I don't give a damn about them. They never cared about Blacks. Blacks care about everyone, yet no one cares about us. We aren't in the position to look out for others' interests. If they were stupid enough to give away their stuff, sell or use inferior weapons to defend their land, that's on them. They didn't give slave refuge in any numbers. I don't think that's true, Larry. But why don't you respond to him, Mark Fancher?
Oh, yes. And it's, you know, I don't want to go right at the person that says that, but
Yeah.
it is common because it's a common sentiment, because people just don't know the information, which is what we're talking about. You know, the more facts that people have, the more that they know. The fact is that many times when enslaved Africans escaped from plantations, they were protected by indigenous communities, by First Nations peoples. Not only were they taken in, they were made members of the tribes. They were given wives. Sometimes they became chiefs. If you want to talk specifically, you know, about several of nations where there were military alliances established between escaped people who were enslaved and indigenous people, the Natchez, the Mohegan, and most particularly the Seminole in Florida, where they went, entire communities of escaped enslaved Africans established farms and communities, and they worked hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with the Seminole people. And when the U.S. Military came into Florida trying to retake that territory, they formed a military alliance, which not only fought the U.S. military, they whooped them, they beat them, they pushed them back out of Florida. And that was because of the solidarity. And I think that what we also have to understand about this history is that there were 5 tribes in the South that did take Africans as slaves. They because they were willing to take Africans as slaves, they were called the civilized tribes, the quote unquote civilized tribes. And there are many people who latch on to that and say, see, that's the reason why we shouldn't support them, because they enslaved us. Well, that's not the full story. The full story is that except for the Chickasaw, when you talk about the Creek, Cherokee, the Seminoles, the others that are members of that group of 5, they had no comprehension or understanding of chattel slavery in the way that white slavers did. And when these people came into their communities, they were treated much as they would treat their relatives. They would treat anybody else. And because they were treating them well, there were people that came in, white people who came in and said, "You're doing this all wrong. You don't know how to deal with these people." So we have to understand that this history that we have is one that we have to, and even if we didn't have good relationships with them, let's assume that we didn't. We have to understand that African people and the First Nations people, the indigenous peoples, are the only 2 groups in this country who did not volunteer to become part of the United States of America experiment. It was imposed on both groups, by force and through bloody conquest and through slavery. And for that reason alone, we share common interests in our efforts to try and achieve justice. And, justice for us means overturning this system in very fundamental ways that only our communities, our respective communities, First Nations peoples and, African peoples, we're the only ones who really understand that and would be prepared to go the distance. Unless, of course, we're just so desperately confused, willfully confused, willfully ignorant, and we just, for whatever reason, still believe, that somehow the United States of America is just waiting to take us in and to make us full-fledged, first-class, participating citizens in this experiment, which they are not, and they never will be.
Chaparral said, I've been arguing on Facebook all day about them celebrating this day. One person said, oh, Columbus wasn't the only person to commit genocide against Black people and indigenous people, really, primarily indigenous people. What do you say to that, Dwight? Dwight, can you hear me? Well, Commissioner Johnson.
I can't hear the question. Say it again.
Okay, he said, Chaparral said she's been arguing on Facebook all day about celebrating this day. One person said Columbus wasn't the only person to commit genocide against Black people. He primarily committed genocide.
And whoever else committed genocide against Black people. Whoever else committed genocide against Black people or indigenous people should also be held accountable. Mm-hmm. It's he should not be given a pardon because he was not the only one. I mean, and we should expose those people who have done that. And he's one of the few people who have committed genocide and yet has been celebrated. I mean, we don't celebrate Mussolini. We don't celebrate Hitler. We don't celebrate those villains in society. Al Capone is Italian. We wouldn't have a holiday for him. There are a lot more people who have done good who can be celebrated, like Mother Cabrini, or like Jody Maggio, or people, Italians who have Marconi, noble Italians who've done great things that have benefited humanity. We don't have to take the worst of the worst and turn them into heroes. There are enough good people to work with for us to celebrate them as opposed to exalt and lie about the bad people.
You know what, Mark Fancher and Commissioner Johnson, it seems that the former narrative, the historical narrative that we've had up until now of Christopher Columbus was useful. What has changed? What has changed? Starting with you, Brandon Johnson, because Commissioner, you are also in the political space, you're in the education space, but you're also in the political space. What has changed, if anything at all?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Santita. I believe what has changed are the people who are now in political space. Look, the truth has always been there, but you finally are beginning to see like the full manifestation, the fruit of the labor that a generation ago laid the foundation for. I'm not here on my own, Santita. I'm not. And the consciousness that we have developed is the direct result of the generation that raised us. And there's a generation that gave us the temerity to actually stand up to the power structure that used to brutalize our people and run them out of the South as they were essentially registering people to vote. And I have a certain level of comfort because you can't run me out. You can't run me away. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't threats, to our political future, but we don't have to live under the fear and the threat of the type of brutality that was administered against our people a generation ago, let alone a couple of 100 years ago. And so that's why it's imperative that not only we take these fights on, but we win them because the victory has already been won. Like there's a generation that has literally laid the groundwork for this moment. And look, I don't want to go too far up on a tangent, but again, everybody knows that the political structure that gave President Barack Obama the pathway to victory, that foundation was laid before a signature was signed to put his name on the ballot. And it's just like now, eradicating the celebration of our people's trauma, that groundwork has been laid. And for folks who are afraid or intimidated, I get it to some extent. I'm just here to say we don't have to be afraid anymore. And so what completely has changed is the opportunity and the moment to be great. The last thing that I'll say is political figures get to be great because of the moment. Look, President Biden's political career goes back a long way, longer than I've been alive. It's not like these issues did not exist then. What has given him the courage to do what no other president has done before is the work that is happening in Cook County, the work that is happening in Miami-Dade County, the work that is happening in Houston, Harris County, right? All over the country, people have been crying out for justice. The regularly scheduled pandemic of structural inequality and racism has been before us for far too long. And I remember I had a chance to take a trip with Reverend Jackson to Selma. And one of the most humbling moments along that trip, Santita, is when Reverend Jackson began to say to me that at that time I wasn't a commissioner, so he just called me Brandon. And he said, Brandon, sometimes we would move through towns and we would barely pick up a few people. Mm-hmm. And we got to that Edmonds Pettus Bridge and we were tired. And even after we won, we realized, and you've heard him say this before, we jumped and hit our heads on the ceiling in the basement. And for a political giant like Reverend Jackson to recognize that the great triumph, right, of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, he recognized that there's another floor for us to get to. It would be shameful and disrespectful to that legacy for us not to walk up the stairs. We don't even have to sneak around the back door. We can just go up those stairs and get to the next level. And that's what this fight is about. That's what's different now, is you have a political opportunity to do something great because what our forefathers and mothers did.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Mark Fancher, that he would bring up that example, because at the signing of the Voting Rights Act, what's interesting, because all of this is tied up together. One of the things that struck me about his speech that day was that he exhorted Negro leaders, which is what we were called at the time. He said, now go home and teach your people to be citizens. In 1965, we'd been here several hundred years already. But he said, now you are full citizens. Because he got into office and said, wait a minute, this was from 1870. This hasn't been enforced in almost 100 years. I've got to get a Voting Rights Act because these people still can't vote. I mean, Mark Fancher, it seems to me that, I mean, because there's so much about the fight of the indigenous people that we know, none of us know. Do you think that is important for us to really understand these fights? And why is it important for African Americans in particular to be in league with the indigenous people, Mark?
Well, you know, as I noted earlier, you know, they are the only other group that is comparable to us in terms of from the outset, there being a deliberate, conscious plan to exclude us from participation in the U.S. experiment. The United States Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott opinion, made it quite clear. I mean, they stated it explicitly that the United States was not intended to include African people. They said it, they couldn't have been more clear. They said it pretty much like I just said it. And in another opinion, Johnson versus McIntosh, they said essentially the same thing about indigenous peoples. There's a lot of language in that opinion about how this country was populated by wild, uncivilized people, and that if the authors of the Declaration of Independence had intended to include indigenous peoples in it, they rightfully would not have enjoyed the respect of the world, you know, because that would have been just such an unthinkable thing to do. And so therefore, in terms of their ruling, they could not contemplate the idea that these people would enjoy any type of, potential for becoming part of this. So the country has been structured and designed to exclude us. And yet, there are many within our communities who, at least in terms of African communities, who still hold on to the hope or the belief that we can become part of this. It was not designed to include us. And we really need to be conscious of that. We need to be aware of that. And we need to be fighting for a reality that in terms of justice, that does not contemplate us becoming part of the U.S. family. It's not going to happen. It will not happen. We need to think about something else. And I think that part of what we think about would benefit from including another community that also is in the same situation as us. Because in order to do justice for both of our communities, it requires the dismantling of the United States of America. To do justice for African people means that you're going to take account of everything that's been taken from us, in terms of our even having lost connection with our ancestry. Most of us have, we can do DNA testing and find out sort of what region we came from in Africa, but we don't know our true names. We don't know our true relatives. We don't know our true traditions. That is incalculable in terms of the amount of money that, would be needed to compensate for that. It's incalculable. And we haven't even reached the question of labor and the systemic oppression that's been heaped upon our people. The U.S. Treasury would never be able to pay that. In terms of First Nations peoples, in order to do justice for them, what it requires is returning to them the territory that's been stolen, which is the entire United States of America, lock, stock, and barrel. And the United States is not prepared to do that, which is why they're so they're so afraid of our communities and our demands for justice, because if you look at what's required, it requires dismantling it. And the fact is that many times those proposed resolutions of this, which are necessary in order to really eliminate the so-called race problem in this country, you can't eliminate the race problem until you've dealt with these communities and given them justice. They're laughed off as being impractical, unrealistic, absurd, because it would just totally dislocate people and destroy everything. But they forget, and this is why history is important, they forget that Andrew Jackson went into southeastern United States, and the Cherokee in particular, and the Choctaw and others, who had been in that region for longer than anybody could imagine. They made them destroy and dismantle their civilization, their societies, and they marched them all the way across the country in what's called the Trail of Tears to desolate places in Oklahoma and other places, totally destroying their societies. And nobody thought anything about it. It's good enough for them, but it's not good enough for the settlers who have come here and stolen the territory from them. We really need to understand that.
We really do need to understand our history. I'm going to get a minute apiece from each of you to close this out, but I'm really glad that we were able to extend this conversation. Hold on, Dwight. Dwight, hold on one moment, because we're going to need to wrap things up. What I want to do is give everyone an opportunity to close out. So I'll start with you, Dwight.
I was going to say, one reason that we can't afford to repay them is because all of the gold in Fort Knox is their gold. Our gold came from California and Colorado. Those are Indian territories. And so the gold that we stole, we would need to have to repay them with their own gold. I mean, all the resources that we take for granted in this country really belong to somebody else. That's the truth. That's the honest to goodness truth. And so we would have to count on their mercy and their grace to allow us to participate in their land. And outside of more genocide, which we have committed for these last 400 years, we'd have to depend on them to be loving and forgiving and give them the right to reconcile with us.
That's important. Commissioner Brandon Johnson, what's the way forward? How can we support what you are doing politically? Because it's not just what you're doing, it's what you're doing for us, it's what you're doing for our children. I mean, it's a winnable fight, but we have to know that the fight is on and what you need us to do. How can we support this effort?
Well, thank you for this conversation tonight, Santita. And my closing thoughts to your question around what we can do. It's a full package of a legislative agenda of fighting for equity and justice. And that full package includes, to Mark's point, the connection between Indigenous people and Black folks. The Indian Removal Act is being executed against Black folks in Cook County. We can just call it the Negro Removal Act, right? We've just seen the census, and we see where it's happening all over the country, where the neighborhood that I'm raising my family in, Austin, on the west side of Chicago, which is still the largest Black community ever in the world, but this community is now the second largest community in Chicago because of the Negro Removal Act. And so the work that was done hundreds of years ago to assimilate Indigenous people, that same work has been attempted in our public school system by removing Black teachers from the teaching force, shutting our schools down, cutting off transportation, removing affordability in public housing. And so to the brothers and sisters out there who want to understand the connection, is because white supremacy has not changed its playbook. It continues to execute its wickedness against all groups, and particularly Black and brown folks. And so whether we're fighting for transportation, affordable housing, a holiday to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day and to bring reconciliation, All of this is an effort to move forward. And so conversations like this, challenging elected officials to stand up for the interests of people of color in particular, and especially Black folks who have experienced tremendous harm over the course of the last 20 years, we can do this collectively by recognizing the playbook that has been used against other groups and the playbook that is, of course, that is being used against us today. So our commitment for justice, we march on. And so continue to challenge elected officials, including myself, to stay strong, because we do get weary along the way, to continue to encourage our brothers and sisters who are part of the labor movement, who are part of community-based organizations, who are part of our faith community, that we can't get weary in our well-doing. So thank you again for the conversation tonight, Santita.
No, thank you for your work. Thank you for your work. And, Mark, I want you to wrap things up. I guess it would be Kotla 671 says Guam needs help and serious recognition of our right to self-determination. Amen to that. We have thousands of indigenous people from Guam with very little recognition received. And we have Puerto Rico, which is our colony. We have the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is our colony. Functionally, the Philippines are our colony. Colonialism, imperialism is still in full effect. Mark Fancher, why don't you wrap this up for us tonight?
Yes, on that point, imperialism is global, and I think that that's where the hope for all of the oppressed people in the world lies, in reaching out, alliances between not just African people and indigenous peoples in the United States, but with all people who are oppressed throughout the world. We cannot be beaten if we unite in that way. But the other thing that I want to suggest as we close is that I try very hard to take very careful note of things that happen, because very often the little things that happen are God at work. And I just take great delight in watching him work his miracles. And I do know that it's not that long ago when there was fierce resistance to even the idea of eliminating, indigenous peoples as from being mascots and brands for sports teams and things like that. I know because I fought a lot of those battles and ran up against brick wall after brick wall, got no results whatsoever. But I know that within just the last couple of years, there have been changes after changes after changes. These mascots are going away. Even for teams that you never thought that they would get rid of their mascots, they are. Mm-hmm. That's God's reaching into the hearts of people and transforming people, changing people. The fact that the president of the United States it's a small thing, but the fact that he's willing to acknowledge indigenous peoples and to make it a shared holiday, that's the result of God's work. And so we just have to be still and not stress. We have to do our part. We have to work really hard, but victory is assured, and it's not on our time, but on His. And it's just a magnificent thing to just watch it happen.
Amen. And if you look at the book of Revelations, as I think that everyone on this panel has, and if you haven't, I urge you to do so. God has already won. And on that great getting up morning when we see God, the question will be, what did you do to make my kingdom as real on earth as it is in heaven? So I agree with you, Mark. I agree with you, Dwight. I agree with you, Brandon. This is the God factor at work, as my mother just talks about all the time. Do not be not anxious, and do not be weary. Don't get weary in well-doing. Don't do that. We've got to keep on fighting. The fact is, this victory for the indigenous people is a victory for all people who have lived on the downside of advantage. It's a victory for everybody. Just as eliminating chattel slavery in the United States was a victory for everybody. No one can be free until everyone is free. And until you get justice for the indigenous people who were the first sinned against on these shores in this European project, no one will receive justice. And so let us continue to move forward. As James Weldon Johnson said, let us march on till victory is won. And you know what, Mark? You know what, Brandon? You know what, Dwight? And all of my morning stars are here. Maria, who's always holding up the flag for Puerto Rico. Julia and Lorraine and everybody. You know what? God has already won. Now, what are we going to do? Please support Commissioner Brandon Johnson in his efforts to get this holiday through, to get this commemoration through, and support our representatives all around the country. Our president, who you might think this is a small thing. This is not a small thing. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. We're watching this arc bend toward justice, Mark Fancher and Brandon Johnson and Dwight McKee. We're watching it, and we are so blessed at this time to have God let us dwell together in this moment in history where we're watching a great reset. I don't know what the elites are talking about. When I say a great reset, when I see one, I see God making things right. And he's making things right. God is making things right as we're watching. And God is watching us. What are you going to do to make things right? What are you going to do? Think about that, everybody. Tomorrow on my show on the Santita Chapter, we are talking what a cash society means for poor people, for Black people, for brown people. You know, most of us gig. You know, most of us live on cash. Most of us don't have enough credit to get a good charge card at a reasonable rate. What does it mean when we're being restricted? When we're not being allowed to use cash? We're going to be talking about that. We're going to talk about this political fight in Washington with John Nichols. We have some COVID-19 Q&A. Many of you have a lot of questions that you had today that we were not able to answer about vaccine hesitancy, about vaccine confusion, about booster confusion. We'll be talking with Dr. Deborah Holden and Dr. Shanina Knighton about that. And of course, we'll get good news from Pastor Stephen Thurston, the teaching pastor of the Salem Baptist Church, the House of Hope. So I'll be with you tomorrow, God willing, but I want to thank you, Mark Fancher. I'm glad, you know what? He's an on-time God. Yes, he is. Might have been a little late, but guess what? You were right on time, my brother. I love it. And Brandon Johnson, Commissioner Johnson, thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for all the work that you do. I can't wait for you to, how can we get your book? Give us a short synopsis of your book before we go, Mark Fancher.
Oh, well, yeah, it's a novel. It's called The Negroes of Friends Village. It's set in 1967, and it's a small town in North Carolina called Friends Village that was established by Quakers back in the 1800s. It was a former stop on the Underground Railroad, and racial harmony prevails there miraculously in North Carolina in 1967. But there's a cross burning that turns everything upside down. And it focuses on the people and the events and activities within the Black community there, all of the things that they go through. It's funny, it's dramatic, it's suspenseful, but ultimately I hope it teaches some lessons about, America, white people, Black people, where we need to go.
Amen to that. Well, I can't wait to have you on in the next couple of weeks. I promise you'll be on the show talking about that because I think it's important for us to read and to be engaged. Maybe that's something you can share with some of your old students, Commissioner Johnson. Blessings to you. I'm sending everybody
Absolutely.
much. I know, because we got to get our children, and we all need to be engaged in the life of the mind and start reading again. Everybody, I hope that you had a good time tonight. I hope you got some good information, and I hope that you commemorated Indigenous Peoples Day. I hope you thought about all of those children that they are finding buried, their bodies have cried out from the grave, and they're being brought up in Canada. We've yet to do that here in the United States. Everybody needs justice. Everybody needs justice, and everybody deserves it. And we all need to fight for each other. My father said when he ran for president in 1983, he said, gay people, you're right. Black people, you're right. Latinx people, you're right. Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, you're right. He went through the whole list. He said, you know what? But your patch is not big enough. But if we sew all these patches together and come up with a great American quilt, we can all stay warm. We can all get shelter from these fierce, fierce winds and and troubling times that just swirl about us. So everybody, God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow. I'm looking forward to being with you. God bless you, Mark Fancher, Commissioner Brandon Johnson, Attorney Fancher, Commissioner Johnson, Dwight McKee. I love you all. I love all my morning stars. You all were with me more than 12 hours ago. That's right. Maria started with me at 5:45 this morning. Yes. I gotta give them. And Andre was with me at 6. So I'm sending all of you much love, and Lorraine and Mark and everybody. And Carol out there on the left coast. She's with us at just before 4 in the morning. I just love you all, and thank you. You keep me moving, everybody. Love you, love you, love you, everybody. And it is an excellent book, Dave Dowling. So get it. Again, how can we get it? Mark Fancher?
You can get it on Amazon. The title is The Negroes of Friends Village. You go to Amazon, type that in, it'll come right up, and you can order it and have it in a day or two.
Go on and do it, everybody. Mark Fancher, Fancher. Just go on and get the book, because he also has another one that I ordered. So I thank you very much. I love it, love it, love it. I love it, because you wrap everything around. God is at the center of joy. God bless you, everybody. See you in the morning. I got to be up at 2 o'clock, so I got to go to bed. Love you. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.